Click.
The sixth time they forgot to invite us to Christmas dinner. My phone stayed silent like it was proud of itself. I sat at our kitchen table with a mug of coffee going cold, watching my wife, Loretta, pretend she wasn't listening for a ringtone that never came. When our daughter Kendra finally called 2 days before Christmas, her voice was bright in that practiced way, and she said, "Oh, Dad, we thought you and Mom were doing your own thing this year." I felt that old sting behind my ribs, the one that says you're still useful but no longer wanted, and I hated that it could still reach me at 60. Loretta didn't cry, she just looked at me like, "Well, are we going to beg for a seat again?" So I said, calm enough to surprise myself, "No, sweetheart, we're doing our own thing now." And I ended the call before I could hear her relief. I went online that night and bought a small place in the mountains for a week. Nothing fancy, just a cabin with pine trees, clean air, and a fireplace that wouldn't judge us for being the extra parents. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing. But for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. Loretta raised one eyebrow when I told her, like she was deciding whether this was a midlife crisis or a late-life rescue. Then she quietly said, "Good." And that one word hit me harder than any argument. We packed like two people who'd learned to travel light, until I tried to lift the suitcase and my back reminded me I'm not 25. So I had to do that dignified old man shuffle while pretending it was just the angle. On the drive up, I kept thinking about all the little times we swallowed disrespect because it was easier than making a scene, and I felt something in me harden into a thin, steady line. The cabin was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you realize how loud your own family can be when they don't even mean to be cruel. That first evening, Loretta sat by the window with her tea, and I caught my reflection in the glass. Older, tired, but not finished, and I promised myself we wouldn't go home feeling smaller. What I didn't know was that Kendra and my son Miles weren't done treating us like an afterthought, because someone back in town still had a spare key to a house they didn't own. And while we were up there, building a tiny Christmas of our own, they were already planning to show up unannounced, certain we'd be gone. The first night in the cabin, I woke up convinced the furnace had died, only to realize I'd forgotten how mountain silence sounds when you're used to city noise. I stood there in my socks, shivering like a fool, poking at the thermostat while Loretta watched me with that look that says, "This man raised children somehow." By morning, the place smelled like pine and burnt toast because I tried to get festive and nearly set off the smoke alarm with bread that had no business being toasted that long. We laughed about it, the kind of laugh that feels earned after years of swallowing harder ones. And for a moment, I almost forgot why we were there. Then my phone buzzed. Not a Christmas greeting, not an apology, but a group text about who was bringing dessert to their dinner back home. No one noticed we weren't on the list, and that hurt more than if they'd said it out loud. I stared at the screen, feeling that familiar pressure behind my eyes, and told myself I was too old to feel this invisible. Yet there I was, proving myself wrong. Loretta squeezed my hand and said, "At least no one here expects us to wash dishes for 12 people, and I nodded like a man who'd finally learned a lesson late. We took a walk down a narrow trail, and I slipped on ice almost immediately, catching myself on a tree like it was an old friend who knew my clumsiness well. I joked that if I broke a hip, at least the kids would finally have to visit, but the joke tasted bitter even as I said it. Back at the cabin, I noticed the front door lock looked different, like someone had tested it before, and my stomach tightened without asking permission. I reminded myself I was being paranoid, that spare keys were just spare keys, not invitations. Still, I checked my phone again and saw a missed call from Miles that came through hours earlier, right when we'd been unpacking. I didn't call back, because something told me that silence was no longer an accident. It was becoming a choice on both sides. And as the afternoon light faded over the trees, I felt the calm of the mountains give way to a quiet unease, like something unwanted was already on its way up the road. By the third morning, the mountain air had done its job and cleared my head enough to let the anger surface properly. I stood on the porch holding a cup of coffee that tasted like I'd rinsed the mud with pine needles, watching my breath fog the cold, and I realized how tired I was of pretending this didn't hurt. Loretta was inside humming softly, the same tune she uses when she's steadying herself, and that sound carried more strength than any speech. I checked my phone again and saw a new message from Kendra asking, "Did you guys already leave town?" with a smiley face that felt misplaced. I typed a reply, deleted it, typed again, and finally put the phone down because I didn't trust myself not to sound like a wounded man begging for relevance. Instead, I tried to fix a loose step on the porch and promptly dropped the hammer, which bounced once and vanished into the snow like it was making a clean escape from me. I muttered that even my tools were abandoning me now, and Loretta laughed from inside, telling me to stop fighting inanimate objects. When I finally retrieved the hammer, my knees complained loudly, and I took that as a reminder that time is undefeated, but dignity doesn't have to be. Over breakfast, Loretta said quietly, "They didn't forget us, you know," and the truth of it landed heavier than if she'd raised her voice. I nodded, feeling that slow burn of injustice, the kind that doesn't explode but settles deep and stays warm. Later that day, I noticed tire tracks near the cabin that hadn't been there before, half covered by fresh snow, like someone had come close and then thought better of it. My mind started connecting dots I didn't want connected, and I hated how easily suspicion comes when trust has been worn thin. That evening, as the sky turned the color of old steel, my phone buzzed again, this time a voicemail from Miles saying, "Dad, we might swing by the house later, just to check something." He didn't say which house, and he didn't wait for an answer. I sat there listening to the message twice, feeling a mix of insult and resolve, because whatever they were planning back home, it was clear they still thought our lives ran on their schedule. That night, sleep refused to come, like it knew I hadn't earned peace yet. I lay there listening to the wind scrape against the cabin walls, counting the little aches in my body the way other men count sheep. Around midnight, I heard a faint thud outside and nearly launched myself out of bed before my knees reminded me I'm built more for speeches than sudden heroics. I grabbed the flashlight, which of course flickered like it was also nervous, and stepped onto the porch in my slippers, feeling ridiculous and alert at the same time. There was nothing there, just snow, trees, and the sound of my own breathing, but the unease stayed, settling in my chest like unfinished business. Back inside, I tripped over the rug we'd sworn to straighten earlier, and Loretta whispered, half asleep, "If you break something, don't bleed on the carpet." I almost laughed, because that's who we are now, old enough to joke about injuries instead of pretending we're invincible. In the morning, the silence felt heavier, not peaceful, and I noticed the porch step I'd fixed was scuffed again, like someone had tested it with a careless boot. I told myself it could have been an animal, but animals don't use the front door. My phone buzzed with a message from Miles saying, "Just checking. You're definitely out of town, right?" And that word definitely set my teeth on edge. I stared at the screen, feeling the slow humiliation creep in, the realization that they were treating our absence like a convenience they needed confirmed. Loretta watched my face change and said, calm but sharp, "They're planning something. Not as a question, but as a fact." I wanted to argue, to cling to the idea that this was all coincidence, but at 60, denial feels heavier than truth. I replied with a simple, "We're fine," and nothing else, because for once I wanted them uncertain. As the day wore on and the sky darkened early, I felt the tension tighten, knowing that whatever they thought they were entitled to back home was about to collide with the one thing we hadn't lost yet, our sense of ownership over our own lives. By the fifth day, the weight of being dismissed had turned into something sharper, something that didn't ache anymore but pressed. I tried to distract myself by shoveling the porch, slipped almost immediately, and caught myself mid-fall with a noise that sounded heroic until Loretta asked if I'd just greet-hugged the snow. We laughed, but it faded fast, because laughter doesn't erase patterns, it just pauses them. Over lunch, my phone lit up again, this time a short message from Kendra asking where the winter coats were stored, as if we were still on household duty. I felt that old humiliation rise, the kind where you realize people only miss you when they need something you own. I typed back nothing, set the phone face down, and noticed my hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, but from restraint. Loretta watched me carefully, the way she does when she knows I'm choosing silence over explosion. She said, "They've been walking into our lives without knocking for years," and I hated how right she was. Later, I tried to fix the radio to get some music going, but all I managed was static and a lecture from Loretta about not forcing buttons that don't want to move, advice I probably should have taken decades ago. In the afternoon, A neighbor's truck drove past the cabin slowly, and I caught myself wondering if word traveled faster than honesty back home. Another message came in, this time from Miles. We used the spare key once before, remember? That sentence sat there, bold in its casual entitlement, and something inside me finally cracked. Not loudly, but cleanly. I realized they weren't asking permission because they'd never been taught they needed it. I stood by the window watching snow drift down, thinking about all the times we'd said yes to keep peace, and how expensive that peace had been. As night fell, I understood this wasn't just about Christmas dinner anymore. It was about whether we'd keep letting ourselves be unlocked whenever it suited them. And somewhere back home, they were already moving toward a door they believed would open, completely unaware that this time, the house was very much alive and waiting. The sixth evening arrived with a sky so clear it felt like it was watching us back, and I couldn't shake the sense that time was tightening its grip. I decided to be useful and cook dinner, which turned into a quiet battle with a stubborn can opener that finally surrendered right as Loretta walked in and applauded like I'd won a medal. We ate in near silence, not uncomfortable, just focused, the way people get when they know something is coming and don't want to waste energy pretending otherwise. After dishes, I checked the security app on my phone, something I'd installed years ago and barely used, and felt foolish for needing it now. The camera feed showed our front hallway back home, empty and calm, and I told myself I was overreacting. Then a notification popped up saying the system had been accessed earlier that day, and my chest tightened as if the room had lost a little air. Loretta leaned over my shoulder and said, steady as ever, "They're testing boundaries," and I realized she'd already crossed this bridge in her mind. I tried to joke that at least someone still found our house interesting, but the words didn't land the way they used to. My phone buzzed again, Miles this time, asking if we'd changed the alarm code, framed like a casual question you ask about the weather. I didn't answer, because answering felt like surrender, and silence felt like the last tool I had left. I walked outside to clear my head, slipped on the icy step again, and had to grab the railing like it was an old friend keeping me upright. Standing there, breathing in cold air, I thought about how age teaches you patience but doesn't erase the need for respect. When I came back inside, Loretta was already packing a small bag, not to leave, but to be ready. She looked at me and said, "Whatever they do next, we don't flinch," and I nodded, feeling something solid return to my spine. Because while they were back home rehearsing how easily our door would open, we were learning how to stand still and let the truth walk right in. The morning of the seventh day started with an alert that cut through the quiet like a dropped plate. My phone buzzed on the table, and for a second my hands hesitated, because some messages change the shape of your day before you even read them. The notification said the front door at our house had been unlocked, and I felt a strange mix of relief and insult, like finally catching someone in a lie you've known about for years. I sat down too fast and missed the chair by an inch, proving that dignity sometimes comes with bruises, and Loretta told me to breathe before I broke something important, like my pride or my hip. The camera feed showed Kendra and Miles in our hallway, coats still on, looking around like they owned the place, and were mildly disappointed we hadn't left snacks out. They moved with confidence, not guilt, and that was the part that hurt the most. I watched Miles open a drawer we keep private, and something inside me went very still, the way anger settles when it's done negotiating. I wanted to shout through the phone, to demand explanations, but at my age I've learned that silence can be louder than any lecture. Loretta stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder, and I realized she wasn't shaking, she was anchored. I tried to make a joke about at least someone finally checking if the house was still standing, but my voice cracked halfway through, betraying me. They didn't call, didn't ask, didn't hesitate, and that told me everything about how they saw us now, not as parents, but as storage units with memories attached. When the feed went dark, I felt an unexpected calm, the kind that comes right before a storm breaks cleanly. I straightened up, rubbed my lower back like an old habit of courage, and said out loud, "That's enough," not to Loretta, but to the years behind us. For the first time all week, I wasn't afraid of what they'd do next. Because while they were standing in our house believing they'd crossed a quiet line without consequence, they had no idea the story had just changed hands, and Loretta was ready to speak.
When I saw our children on the screen inside our house, something quiet inside me finally stood up straight. I didn't gasp or cry, even though that used to be my instinct years ago, back when I thought understanding would fix everything. Instead, I felt oddly calm, the way you do when a long illness finally gets a name. I told my husband to sit down before his knees betrayed him again, and he tried to protest until his leg agreed with me instead. Watching Kendra open cabinets like she was checking inventory made my jaw tighten, not in anger, but in recognition of how comfortable she felt crossing us. Miles leaned against the wall the way he used to as a teenager, and it hit me that he'd never really stopped seeing this place as something he could take from. I said quietly, "They are here to check on the house," and my husband nodded like he'd been waiting for permission to believe it. I poured tea and missed the cup slightly, splashing the saucer, which felt almost poetic given how controlled I suddenly felt inside. We cleaned it up together without speaking, the way couples do when words might get in the way of clarity. I remembered every Christmas I'd hosted, every plate I washed while others relaxed, every time I told myself this was just how families worked. Seeing them there without us made it clear it wasn't family warmth they missed, it was access. I leaned closer to the screen and noticed Miles checking the hallway closet, the one with papers we never talked about. My husband muttered that maybe they were just looking for coats, but I shook my head gently because mothers know when something has shifted. I wasn't angry anymore. I was resolved, and that felt heavier and cleaner at the same time. As the camera followed them deeper into the house, I reached for my phone, already knowing this moment would decide what kind of future we were walking back into. And while they moved through our rooms with borrowed confidence, they had no idea that I was about to stop being the quiet one. I sat closer to the screen and noticed details I might have ignored years ago, back when I still made excuses for them. Kendra kept glancing at her phone, not nervously, but impatiently, like time was wasting her instead of the other way around. Miles opened a drawer, closed it, then opened another, moving with purpose, and I felt that old maternal instinct flare, not to protect him, but to protect what was ours. My husband hovered behind me, trying to see over my shoulder, and knocked his elbow on the table hard enough to hiss through his teeth, which almost made me smile despite everything. I told him to stop looming like a confused shadow, and he muttered that he just wanted to be ready if I needed moral support or a chair. What struck me most was how comfortable they looked, as if our absence had finally made the house behave properly. I remembered how many times they'd said, "We didn't want to bother you," when what they really meant was, "We didn't want you in the way." On the screen, Kendra headed toward the study, the one room I'd always kept organized because I believed order could hold a family together. I felt my chest tighten, not with panic, but with the weight of knowing exactly what she was looking for. My husband whispered, "Loretta would have shut that door," and I corrected him gently, reminding him I am Loretta and I'd been shutting doors quietly for years. I realized then how often silence had been mistaken for permission. As Miles reached for a folder on the shelf, my husband sat down heavily, missing the chair slightly and blaming the lighting like it had betrayed him. I placed my hand on his shoulder, steady and warm, because this wasn't the moment for comfort, it was the moment for clarity. I didn't raise my voice or rush for the phone. I simply watched, absorbing every movement, every assumption. Because with each step they took through our house, they were making a case against themselves. And once they crossed that study threshold, there would be no pretending this was just a misunderstanding anymore. When Kendra stepped into the study, I felt a slow, deliberate tightening in my chest, not fear but focus. That room had always been my line, where our life was recorded in papers, letters, and decisions we made quietly without asking for applause. Miles hovered behind her, pretending to admire the bookshelf, the same shelf my husband once assembled backwards and blamed on creative design. I almost smiled at that memory, then watched as Kendra reached for the cabinet we never labeled because we trusted family more than locks. My husband leaned too close to the screen again and fogged it slightly with his breath, then apologized to the phone like it could hear him. I whispered for him to sit, and this time he listened, easing down carefully as if the chair were a negotiation partner. On the screen, Kendra opened a folder and frowned, clearly not finding what she expected, and that small confusion told me everything. They weren't there to borrow. They were there to confirm something without our consent. I felt a flicker of sadness, not for us, but for the children who thought entitlement was the same as closeness. Miles said something I couldn't hear, and Kendra shook her head sharply, frustration written all over her posture. My husband asked if we should call them now, his voice hopeful in a tired way, and I realized he still wanted this to be fixable with words. I shook my head and said, "Not yet, because timing is the difference between pleading and standing firm." I picked up my phone and scrolled to the message draft I'd written the night before, the one I wasn't sure I'd ever send. Seeing them search our private space made the decision settle cleanly into place. I hit save, not send, and set the phone down like a promise to myself. Because while they were finally realizing the house didn't hold what they came for, they still hadn't realized something far more dangerous had changed, the balance of who gets to decide what happens next. I watched them move through the study with growing irritation, not because they were careless, but because they were cautious in the wrong way. Kendra straightened a stack of papers after looking through them, as if tidiness could disguise the fact that she'd crossed a line. Miles checked his watch twice, the same nervous habit he had as a boy when he knew he was pushing his luck. Behind me, my husband tried to whisper something supportive and managed to cough instead, then waved it off like he'd planned the interruption. I placed my finger gently to my lips, not because he was wrong, but because this moment required stillness, not commentary. On the screen, Kendra finally said something sharp enough that I could see Miles stiffen, and I knew patience on their side was thinning. They weren't finding answers, and people who feel entitled don't handle uncertainty well. I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief, realizing how long I'd been managing their feelings instead of my own. My husband shifted again, knees cracking like dry branches, and muttered that his body always chose dramatic timing. I almost smiled, then refocused as Miles reached for the desk drawer, the one my husband always forgot was locked. He tugged once, frowned, and tugged again, irritation flashing across his face. That soundless struggle tightened something in me, because it confirmed what I'd known for years. Boundaries only upset people who plan to cross them. I leaned back and folded my hands, calm and deliberate, feeling steadier than I had in a long time. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a quiet standoff, and they didn't even know they were losing it. As they exchanged looks of frustration, I realized the control they'd assumed was slipping away minute by minute. And when Miles finally said, "Let's just go," I knew the real confrontation was no longer about a house. It was about who would speak first when the silence broke. When they finally left the study, I felt a brief hollow ache, the kind that comes when you realize how close you were to losing something you never thought needed guarding. The camera showed them standing in the hallway, whispering fast, their shoulders tense, and I recognized that posture from years ago, children who knew they'd gone too far but didn't know how to step back. My husband exhaled too loudly, then apologized to the room, saying he forgot houses echo when you hold your breath that long. I told him to relax his shoulders before they turned to stone, and he tried, failing twice, then settling like a chair that finally found balance. Kendra checked her phone again, frustration written across her face, and I realized they'd expected certainty, not resistance. Miles rubbed his forehead the way he does when things don't obey him, and that small gesture cut deeper than any raised voice. I felt the threat clearly then, not of theft, but of erasure, of being reduced to a background detail in our own lives. My husband whispered, "They look mad," and I nodded, because anger is often just entitlement meeting a closed door. On the screen, Kendra paused by the front door and glanced back once, like she was reconsidering whether to leave or push harder. I held my breath, knowing that one more step could change everything. The door finally closed, and the lock clicked, a small sound that felt like a line being drawn. My husband tried to stand too quickly in relief, groaned, and sat back down with a sheepish grin that said victory still has a price at our age. I didn't celebrate. I listened to the quiet and understood that this was only the beginning of the reckoning. They hadn't taken anything tangible, but they'd shown us exactly how close we were to losing control of our own story. I picked up my phone again, this time opening the message draft without hesitation. Because once they realized we knew what they'd done, the next move wouldn't be curiosity, it would be confrontation. I sent the message slowly, reading it twice, not to soften it, but to make sure it was clear and calm. There were no accusations, no anger, just a simple statement that we knew they'd been in the house and that we'd talk when we returned. My husband watched my face like he used to watch weather reports before long drives, trying to guess how rough the road ahead would be. He asked if I was sure, then immediately apologized for asking, because he could already see the answer in my posture. A minute passed, then another, and the silence stretched tight enough to feel deliberate. When Kendra finally replied with, "We just wanted to make sure everything was okay," I felt something inside me go cold and clear. I showed the phone to my husband, and he shook his head, muttering that apparently breaking and entering now counted as concern. He tried to lighten the mood by saying at least they hadn't reorganized the kitchen again, then winced as he stood up too fast and had to grab the table. I told him to sit before he turned righteous anger into a pulled muscle, and he obeyed with a tired smile. What hurt most wasn't the lie, it was how easily they reached for it, how natural it seemed. I typed one final line, "We'll discuss boundaries when we're home," and set the phone down without waiting for a response. In that moment, I understood that confrontation wasn't about raising voices, it was about refusing to shrink. My husband reached for my hand, steady and warm, and for the first time all week I felt us standing on equal ground again. Outside, the mountains were quiet and unmoved, and I took comfort in that kind of strength. Because back home, they were already realizing this wasn't going to be smoothed over with excuses, and that realization was going to force them to face us properly at last. When we finally drove back home, I felt steadier than I had in years, like my spine remembered what it was made for. The house greeted us quietly, unchanged, but no longer taken for granted, and that difference mattered more than fresh flowers ever could. My husband unlocked the door with ceremony, dropped the keys immediately, and bent down too fast to pick them up, proving that authority doesn't cancel gravity. I laughed softly and told him to let the moment breathe before injuring himself on principle. Kendra and Miles arrived an hour later, both trying to look casual in a way that only makes guilt louder. I didn't raise my voice or list grievances. I simply told them what we expected going forward and what would no longer happen without our consent. They tried explaining, justifying, softening words into excuses, but I didn't interrupt because clarity doesn't need competition. My husband added one sentence, calm and final, about spare keys being returned, and I saw something shift in their faces. It wasn't anger, it was surprise, the kind that comes when parents stop bending. Miles nodded first, stiffly, and Kendra followed, quieter than I'd ever seen her, and that silence was the beginning of something healthier. After they left, my husband sank into his chair like a man who'd finished a long job and earned his rest. He asked if we'd gone too far, then corrected himself and said, "No, we went just far enough," and I squeezed his hand. That night, we cooked a simple dinner, burned nothing, and ate without checking our phones. The house felt ours again, not because it had never been violated, but because it had been reclaimed. We hadn't broken, we'd adjusted our stance and stood firm. And as I turned off the lights, I knew one thing with certainty: they hadn't taken our dignity, and they never would again.